Hey David. Hey Benoit. Am I
Hey,
audible? Hey, can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Hey, glad to see that you're a little early. That's always cool.
Yeah, trying to be on time.
Yeah. So are you like a freelancer or how are you working with Bubble?
Um, yeah, I just launched my agency. I'm alone for now,
Okay.
but it's the beginning.
Oh, that's cool. That's nice.
Thanks.
I think this would really help. If you haven't, tried injecting code into your apps, it'll be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Let's wait for a few more people to join and then probably I'll get started. Hey Theo. Hey Andrew. I'm just gonna wait for a few more people to join. Give it a few minutes.
Hello.
Hey everyone, are we ready to get started?
Go for it.
All right.
All right.
Um, cool. So yeah. So a lot of people ask me when I posted about this topic that is it even possible or is it even advisable to inject code into Bubble? And the answer to that is yes, as long as you're not overcomplicating things. So I can actually take you through a few examples as we go through this.
How do
But
I
first,
mute this?
can everyone hear me?
Oh, yes, Ranjit.
All right, cool. So yeah, so coming back, there's a bunch of ways that you can actually insert code into Bubble. And I'm not going to talk about the obvious ways that you can do it, with the app headers and page headers and HTML elements and stuff like that, with script tags. So that's pretty standard. But there are ways that you can insert code into Bubble that you can actually use in your workflows, or you can use to expose, the results of what you run in your JavaScript code on elements that you can actually use in other parts of your Bubble app. So essentially converting what you um, do with your JavaScript code into something that's actually usable in the rest of your app. So the best way to do this is with the Toolbox plugin. I'm just going to take you through a few ways that you can um, do that in an app. I've got my test app open here. And yeah, so essentially the best way to do it, the easiest way to do it is to just run a workflow. So I've got this plugin installed, the Toolbox plugin, and it's got a bunch of these really useful tools that come with it. So I'll just take you through a couple of ways that I usually run JavaScript. So I've got a button, I add a workflow, and the easiest way to do it is run JavaScript from here. So when I run JavaScript from here, it can be whatever. This is going to execute every time this workflow runs. So for example, if I preview this, ignore all of this stuff. There's just stuff. So if I preview my button here and I open the console, I hope everyone knows about this console. You just right click and inspect, and then you can open the console. So this is really handy when you're working with code. So you click on this to say hello, because that's what the workflow asked it to do. So essentially you can run any JavaScript code from here. Another way to do that would be using the expression element, which again comes with the Toolbox plugin. So here you can also set up a result type. I'll come to that later, but you can do something like for example, let's put something dynamic in here. So let's say the page width. So that's going to print the page width, and when I come here, it's going to execute once on page load, and then every time the contents of that code change, every time that the contents update, it's going to run again. So each time it's going to print or execute whatever I put in there. So that's a very handy way of doing things. So yeah, these are basically the my go-to approaches to setting up JavaScript in a Bubble app. There's another server script action that comes with this. We'll take a look at that in a bit. So okay, so this is cool, but then how do you actually put it to use with real data, right? So for that, you need to work with JSON. So JSON is a way of formatting a bunch of data into a single string. So you can actually stringify this entire thing. And this can be passed from place to place in your Bubble app, and then decoded back into JSON to actually use the value in it. So I can actually show you what that looks like. So if I pick up, so this is an array of JSON objects. I'm going to pick up one JSON object, and I'm going to put it here. So for example, so I go to my expression element and I say my var my JSON equals this this object, and so I just need to write a simple function that picks up one of the values that I need. So for example, here the value that I need is the name. Then I will say return x dot, and that should be able to do it. So I just run this function with my JSON, and that should actually result in that. So the value from here, so x dot name, x is this JSON, the name value from this being stored on this expression element. Right. So sorry. All good. Okay, guys, can you mute yourselves if possible? Unless you wanna say something. All right, cool. So I'm going to put up text just to pull the value of that expression is value. So this should be storing basically one of the values of the key that I need to use as a text. And something. All right, so there it is. So basically what this has done is, well, it doesn't look like much here, but essentially it's this expression, so a script this small has actually pulled out one of the values that I need from a JSON string. So imagine this JSON string coming from a dynamic source like an API result or something like that, and then you can actually pull out the values with this expression element without having to use a plugin and stuff like that. So that's where I use this the most. All right. So okay, so the basics are down of how you can insert code to extract data from a JSON, but then you also need to create a JSON to be able to use with API inputs and things like that, where you want to really bundle data together into a single JSON. So for that, I have set up something here to make it easy for you to see it. So essentially what I've done here is I want to format all of my users, the data of all my users on this app as a JSON. So I've got emails, companies, first names, last names, and all of that I want to come in as a JSON array. So that can be done quite easily with a format as text operator. So here we can just do run this on a list, and then for each item in that list, it's going to format that as a JSON object. Delimiter is a comma, and then you just put square brackets around that, and that becomes essentially a JSON array. So I've just displayed this on the screen. So that should look like this. So all of the users in my app are now in a JSON array. So I'm just going to clarify this. Yeah, that's what that looks like, right? So it's quite simple to kind of go between bubble data and JSON and vice versa as well, so that you can use JSON as a way to store data within within workflows, within logic, etc. in your app, and that actually makes it really, really easy to operate, and could also make your app a little lighter. So an interesting example of this is a client project I've been working on requires, they had 17 conditionals on a repeating group, and that was causing a lot of issues on page load and stuff like that. So I put in a expression element, took in all of that data as a JSON. I outputted a bunch of numbers just to kind of be representative of those conditions. And then the conditions just had to be based on the value of that expression. So that really condensed the entire conditionals list. So that's another way you can use expressions. Oh, by the way, I'm going to share this JSON page with everyone later, so don't worry. All right, so okay, we've talked about how to run JSON, how to create JSONs, how to extract values from JSON, how to run JavaScript code in a couple of ways. So there's another interesting functionality that we can leverage in Bubble, and this is actually one of the things I love using to kind of do things that I couldn't do before. So for example, when you want to run a workflow based on something that happens in a script is where I use this JavaScript to bubble element. And this also helps me execute any workflow on a page, regardless of what element it comes from. So what I mean by that is you could, for example, do set up a reusable element and then run a workflow on the parent page if you using the JavaScript to bubble element. So I can show you how that works. So I can put down a JavaScript bubble. So essentially what this does is it's going to let you define a function, a JavaScript function. I'm going to call it test. And this function can actually trigger an event and also publish a value. So you can pass some data to it. All right, so that's set up. Now, what I need to do is I need to run a JavaScript. I just need to run some JavaScript that calls this function. So bubble underscore fn underscore test. And once that runs, it's going to trigger an event and it's going to publish the value of what I pass into that function on this element here. So say if I have a reusable element and I want to do something like that. So I'm gonna do that, and basically this is going to again run JavaScript that does an test, and I'm going to say hello. All right, and that's all. So now I just need to come back to here, and now this is my parent page, and I just pull in the reusable element down here. Come to my JavaScript bubble. Yeah, so that should work. Now, when I click on this, it runs that JavaScript function that calls this particular JavaScript to bubble element. And when that happens, it triggers a workflow which I can access from here. So a JavaScript to bubble event, it picks that one. And then here I can actually, do something, do whatever I want. So I am calling that from the reusable element and running a workflow on the parent page. Okay, see if that works. Okay, so here's my reusable element and that executed. So essentially, again, I triggered a workflow on the parent element from a reusable. So that's always been a challenge, but then that gets solved with something like JavaScript. So it's kind of a thing that triggers another, you can potentially put another JavaScript action here, but it triggers a workflow where you can do whatever you want. And you can also pass it some context. And you can trigger it anywhere in the app as long as it's on the page that you're on. So yeah, that's pretty powerful when you look at applications. We can actually talk about that once we get into QA. I'm going to quickly move into how I condense recursive workflows with JavaScript and some really smart self-data API calls. So self-data API calls is basically something that, I don't know what the name for that is, but essentially it's the app calling its own data API, and there's a bulk endpoint. If you look into, I've added this link here. So essentially, it's an endpoint that lets you create things in bulk. All you need to do is put in, this, a list of things that you want to create, the data that you want to create them with in this JSON-L format, and then you'll be able to run that with that bulk data endpoint, and you'll be able to create things in bulk. So for that, there's a couple of steps. It's not as easy as all this other stuff was, but you need to just set up a couple of things. The first thing to set up would be your data API. So you need to go to settings and make sure that you've got your data API enabled and all the data types that you want to enable it for, right? Once you've done that, make sure that the privacy rules are set up. So I've set up really crap privacy rules here just to make sure it works while I'm demonstrating it. But the Flusk guys are going to kill me for this, but this is not how you set up privacy. But just make sure that the right privacy rule has access to creating via API. That's the point, right? Okay, and then you need to make sure that you set up the right API connection on your API connector. So this is going to call, this is the same app I'm on right now. And I'm just going to use this object form response bulk endpoint. This is my variable that I'm going to pass into the API call, and that's going to be a JSON-L. So JSON-L is basically a line separated JSON, a list of JSON objects, but line separated. So now the question is, how do you come up with that data, right? So if you remember, we looked at how to format data as a list of things as text. So one approach could be you just do this instead of having the square brackets, you can just format as text, and then the delimiter can be a line space. Option number 2 is if you have a slightly more complex functionality going on, you can use a script to actually generate that JSON-L and then pass that into that API call. So what I've done here is I have set up a backend workflow for this, right? And this is an API workflow. And this is the server script I was talking about earlier. So a server script is essentially something that runs JavaScript, and then you can return something back into the workflow so it can be accessed from the next steps. And I didn't write this code. I just asked ChatGPT. I was like, I have a bunch of JSONs. I just picked up what I had done with the format text on the list of users earlier. I just put that in here, and I looked up the right fields that I need for that JSON-L setup that can be accessed from your Swagger file. That's you can look at this. So the equivalent for this, you can just change your app name here, and you'll get your Swagger file. So this contains the documentation for what your data API will look like. So what are the right JSON keys for your data types, fields, etc. that you should use. So mine are like that, like this. And I pass this over to ChatGPT. ChatGPT spat out a nice thick function, which I simply copied. So essentially what I'm trying to do here is I'm emulating one of the challenges that I had on a previous app. So we were running a recursive workflow, and the reason for that was we wanted to only create things if the thing that we were iterating on had certain conditions. So in this case, what I'm kind of emulating here is I'm only going to create, so I have this form response thing. So I'm only going to create a form response thing for users that have email addresses ending in .io, right? So these two. So I've got 6 users, and only 2 of them should actually be able to create form responses. So that's the logic that I'm using. Otherwise, I would have just recursively looped over stuff and done a big massive backend workflow. So that's what that is, and I just put that script in here, and that script outputs the JSON-L that I asked it for. So line separated JSON objects, or only for the right filtered data that I really need. And then all I need to do here is just return that back into this server script action. So once I do that, I can access that text from the next step here. So I've got this button that runs that API workflow, but I'm just going to run that. I hope you can see all this. I'm going to run that with my step-by-step activated. Okay, so that's initiated. Schedule the API workflow. No, it's a backend. Anyway, so that's run the backend workflow. I'll show you the logs for that. And now these two just got created because those were the two ones with the .io. So my script went through all my users, looped through all the users, filtered out the ones that didn't end in IO, and then just made that JSON-L object with the ones that had a .io in the email. So that's like a filtering logic there. And then that gets sent to the API workflow. So in the logs, you will be able to see, yeah, so that's essentially what gets sent into this stuff is what gets sent into the data API bulk API call. And this is how it runs the entire script on the backend. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell, essentially. I think I've got a bunch of chat messages here. Hold on. Yes, you will get a recording after this. Yeah, a couple of precautions. Always use a try catch statement because especially on server side the workflows, because you want to make sure that you don't crash things on the server side. That could be really bad for your app. The data API bulk endpoint has a limit of 1,000 things at a time. So batching is important. And you could also try a few things. Well, if your use case is extremely complex, try creating a plugin. Ankur has built a nice course for this, so that might be helpful. Like I was saying, conditionals can be moved to a toolbox expression element. I do that a lot. And then I also built a toolbox plus plugin because I wanted to extract more than, so currently in the toolbox plugin, you can only extract one value from a JSON at a time. In my case, I wanted to do more than that. So this one lets you do 10 at a time. So yeah, that's essentially everything I had to share today. So if there's any questions, I can dive into that. You could ask me here, or you could just put them in the chat. So yeah, so I've got a question here. Does using JavaScript consume workload units? So the answer is that it depends on where you're using the JavaScript. So essentially, JavaScript will use workload units if it's on a server script. If it's on the front end, it will not use workload units unless, of course, you are, doing a search for things, etc., within your JavaScript code. I think we've got a few more minutes for questions. If there's anyone who has a question.
Time. I'm going to try and break down a lot of different things, a lot of thoughts I have about it. And I started recording this use case and I stopped because I didn't see if you can do this while you guys can hear back to it. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm in the chat here and I'm asking Devin to set up this. What I did was I gave it a GitHub URL, which leads to my Chatbot UI project. And I basically want to see, can it set it up? I think this is the README for this project. It's a fairly complex setup, which is something I'd expect a software engineer to be pretty flawlessly.
Hey, I'm sorry. Your voice is breaking. Could you put that in the chat, please? Sorry, your voice was breaking there. Any other questions? Okay. Do we have a few questions? I can take a few questions. We've got a few minutes left. How can we keep adding in new entries in the JSON and store that as text in one field? So the idea is in chat functionality to store messages as JSON. Okay. Store that as text in one. I didn't get that, Manish. What exactly do you mean? So are you saying you want to store dynamic fields in a JSON? How different is the last action that you showed to edit the users different from creating an API workflow and using it as bulk? You mean, so this is a question from Benoit. So how different is the last action you showed to edit the users different from creating an API workflow and using it as bulk? Do you mean running bulk actions on the app data section?
Yes, when you go in app data and you select the user, and then you can pick an API
Yeah.
workflow that this user as its thing.
So that's an admin side action. So what I was talking about is more to do with, when you want to do a bulk creation of things in your app's actual workflow. So an example of this is like in Atomic Fusion, when we calculate the creator payouts every month, we have to pull a bunch of data from different parts of the database and then decide who gets how much this month. Right? So that whole calculation is pretty hefty calculation. I wouldn't want to do that using app data because it's a lot better to do it dynamically. So in that case, it just makes sense to have it either run once a month, and it automatically does all of that calculation, and then it just populates entries in the database referring to who gets how much. So that's essentially one of the use cases for something like this. Yes, so that would definitely be for actions that you can run on the client side. You can also run it on an API workflow like I did, but yeah, essentially that's the use case. Okay, Manish has another question. So every time a message comes, how can we keep updating that JSON? So see, if like I said, if your JSON is dynamically generated, right? So I did a search for users and then I formatted that as JSON. So that was my JSON that was going into, potentially going into something that's like your messaging system. So it could be a search for messages and then format that as text, and then format that into JSON. So in this case, when it's a dynamic data source, where it's a search for messages in your case, as a new message comes in, that search for messages automatically updates on the client side because there's a sockets connection between the bubble database and the front end. So because of that, if you put it in an expression element, that expression element is automatically going to run again every time that expression updates. So you will have a real-time updated JSON if you source it from the database. I hope that helps. All right, guys, if there's any other questions, you can drop them to me on my Twitter or my LinkedIn. I know this was a bit condensed because we didn't have much time today. And this kind of a thing takes a lot of time to talk about. But I'd love to continue this conversation on LinkedIn and Twitter. And yeah, I hope this really helps. And thanks for attending. Also, if you have feedback about this, you can always drop that to me on my socials as well. Glad to help. I'll be sending the recordings to Sarah and Kelly, and they'll be sharing it with everybody. All right, take care, everyone. See you.